Part 1. My name is Brooke Callahan, and for 3 years I worked for the kind of billionaire people wrote articles about just to complain about how intimidating he was. Adrian Lancaster was young, obscenely wealthy, devastatingly handsome, and emotionally colder than a New York sidewalk in January. I knew because I had spent 1,095 days trying to survive his schedule. I had warmed his milk at 3 in the morning, memorized the exact temperature he wanted his coffee, carried 8 luxury suitcases through JFK while he walked ahead without looking back, and once spent 40 minutes outside in a snowstorm because his regular dog walker had called in sick. His golden retriever, Apollo, loved the snow. I did not. Yet somehow, the most affectionate phrase Brian had ever directed at me was still, "Get out." 3 years earlier, I had entered Lancaster Group as an ambitious 24-year-old determined to prove myself in Manhattan's corporate world. On my first morning, I walked into Brian's office wearing a new suit and the brightest smile I owned. "Good morning, Mr. Lancaster. I'm Brooke Callahan, your new assistant." He never even lifted his eyes from his laptop. Q3 reports. 2 hours. That was my introduction. No handshake. No welcome. Nothing. At first, I told myself that successful people were busy. Then I told myself he was simply private. Eventually, I stopped making excuses for him. By the end of my 3rd year, I knew exactly what Adrian Lancaster was, a man who believed the world existed to respond to his calendar. The final straw came at 2:47 on a Tuesday morning. I had finally fallen asleep after spending the previous evening organizing an investor dinner. In my dream, I was standing on a beach with a surfboard under my arm when my phone vibrated. I opened one eye and answered without checking the caller. "I need 12 copies of the summit proposal in the conference room by 8, Brian said. "Coffee at exactly 100 degrees. My car arrives at 7. Open the door." Click. He hung up. I stared at the ceiling in disbelief. He had not said hello. He had not apologized for waking me. He had not even asked whether I was awake. To Brian, I was not an employee. I was an extension of his phone. At 6:30, I dragged myself out of bed, stared at the exhausted woman in my bathroom mirror, and barely recognized her. 3 years ago, I had been energetic, stylish, and convinced that hard work could take me anywhere. Now I looked like someone who had been personally defeated by a calendar. But something inside me had finally snapped. 2 nights earlier, my father had called. "Sweetheart," he had said, unusually gentle, "come home. You've done your time." My father, Richard Callahan, owned Callahan Enterprises, one of the largest companies in the same industry as Lancaster Group. I had deliberately kept that fact hidden. I wanted to build a career without my father's name opening doors for me. He had agreed to let me work independently for 3 years. Apparently, those 3 years were now over. "We need you at headquarters," he told me. "The board wants a successor, and I want my daughter back." Then he offered me something I had almost forgotten existed: 3 months with no work. A real vacation. Bali. The Maldives. Maybe the Northern Lights. I nearly cried from happiness. That morning, I decided my resignation would be the first step toward freedom. At 5:30, after Brian finished his final meeting, I knocked on his office door. "Come in." I entered carrying the resignation letter I had rewritten 3 times. "Mr. Lancaster, I need to discuss something." He continued reading. "Go ahead." I placed the letter on his desk. He finally looked up. His eyes moved from the paper to my face, and for the first time in 3 years, Adrian Lancaster actually studied me. The silence felt strangely heavy. Then he said one word. "Denied." I blinked. "Excuse me?" He pushed the letter aside. "The annual summit is next week. You're coordinating it." "I'm resigning." "I heard you." "Then you understand." "No." He picked up another document. Your resignation is denied. I stood there speechless. Mr. Lancaster, you can't simply reject a resignation. He did not look up. Close the door when you leave. I walked out feeling as though reality itself had malfunctioned. I immediately texted my father. Dad, he rejected my resignation. His reply came seconds later. Then submit it again. Be firm. You're a Callaway. I smiled despite myself. Fine. The next morning, I printed another copy. This time I placed it beneath his coffee cup before he arrived. At 7:45, Brian entered his office. He picked up the cup, saw the envelope, and calmly folded the letter twice before sliding it back underneath the cup. A coaster. My 3 years of loyalty had officially become furniture. I walked into his office. Mr. Lancaster. He sipped his coffee. Perfect temperature today. The letter. I saw it. Then why is it under your coffee? Because we're not discussing it. He turned toward his computer. The summit is in 6 days. Your lead coordinator. Your resignation can be revisited afterward. I'm giving notice. He looked at me. Are you threatening legal action? I froze. He leaned back. Remember the non-compete agreement you signed? 24 months. My stomach dropped. I had completely forgotten about it. Then I remembered where I was going. Callaway Enterprises. His competitor. He noticed something change in my expression. Planning to leave the industry, he asked. Perhaps. Then the agreement won't concern you. I straightened my shoulders. 30 days. That's my notice. Whether you like it or not, I'm leaving in 30 days. For several seconds he stared at me. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. Curiosity, maybe. Fine, he finally said. 30 days. Until then, you perform your duties. I nodded. Gladly. I walked out before he could change his mind. Janice from accounting was waiting by the coffee machine. Well? I held up 3 fingers. 30 days. She hugged me. You can survive 30 days. I looked at my phone. A new message from Brian appeared. Prepare the client proposal. Arrange my transportation. Pick up my dry cleaning. I stared at the screen and whispered, 30 days. I only need to survive 30 days. I had no idea that Brian Lancaster was about to make those 30 days feel like the longest month of my life. Part 2. The first week of my notice period was proof that Brian Lancaster had either never heard of the concept of mercy or considered it a weakness. The moment he realized I was actually leaving, his demands multiplied. Before my resignation, he had treated me like an endlessly available employee. After my resignation, he treated me like an employee whose remaining days needed to be squeezed for every possible drop of usefulness. At 2:47 the next morning, my phone rang again. The summit seating chart needs to be changed. Move the Callaway delegation closer to the stage. Prepare 3 alternate airport routes. And tomorrow's coffee must be exactly 100 degrees. I stared at the ceiling. Brian, it is 2:47 in the morning. Then you have several hours before sunrise. Click. I slowly lowered the phone. I hate this man. The next morning, Janice took one look at me and laughed. You look dead. I moisturized. He called again? 2:47. Does he have an alarm? Apparently, my suffering is his alarm. She laughed so hard she nearly dropped her coffee. My phone buzzed again. Brian needed his dry cleaning. Then he needed his investor dinner confirmed. Then he needed gift baskets prepared. Then he informed me that Apollo, his golden retriever, had rejected his new dog walker. The dog needs a 6 o'clock walk, he said. The walker cancelled. So? You're taking him. That evening, I stood outside in freezing rain with Apollo staring at me as if he had personally organized the weather. You know, I told him, you and I have something in common. Neither of us chose this. Apollo wagged his tail. Don't look at me like that. You're still getting paid in treats. When I returned to the building, Brian was waiting in the lobby. He checked his watch. You're late. I looked at the rain dripping from my coat. The weather was sideways. Apollo needs consistency. So do employees. The receptionist turned away to hide a laugh. Brian stared at me for a long moment. 3 years ago, I would have apologized. Now I simply walked past him. Something about my attitude seemed to bother him. Not because I was disrespectful, but because I was no longer afraid of him. I had spent years anticipating his reactions. Now I had nothing left to lose. My father called that Thursday. How bad is it? He asked. He's trying to make 30 days feel like 30 years. Want me to intervene? I glanced toward Brian's office. No. Let him keep going. Why? Because he's making my case for me. Dad laughed. That's my girl. I kept documenting everything. Every late-night call. Every personal errand. Every unreasonable demand. Every time he used my resignation as an excuse to assign another task. Every mention of the non-compete. I had a folder on my computer labeled Reasons I Will Never Mississippi This Place. It was becoming a novel. The summit preparations became ridiculous. Brian made me revise welcome cards because the paper looked too warm. I stared at him. Paper has a temperature now? It affects presentation. So does my blood pressure. He ignored me. Then he sent me across Manhattan for a particular brand of imported dog biscuits because Apollo had rejected another brand. On the subway ride back, Apollo somehow ate half a paper receipt from my purse. I looked at him. You are officially the least complicated Lancaster. He wagged his tail. Then came the biggest irony of all. Brian asked me to coordinate the Callaway delegation. I almost laughed. He had no idea that Callaway Enterprises was my family's company. He knew the name, of course. Everyone in our industry did. But he had never once asked about my family. Why would he? In his mind, I was Brooke, his assistant. Nothing more. 2 days before the summit, I was reviewing partnership documents when a call came in from the Callaway team. They had concerns about the exclusivity clause in Brian's proposed deal. I stepped into an empty conference room. Don't accept that clause, I said. Lancaster's supply division can't guarantee that volume without creating major delays. Push for a 6-month review and penalty protections. And tell Dad the third slide is too soft. If he wants leverage, he needs to stop sounding like he's asking permission. I ended the call and turned around. Brian stood in the doorway. My stomach dropped. Who was that? A business call. With whom? That's private. His eyes narrowed. Why have you never mentioned you understand negotiations at that level? I folded my arms. Because you never asked me anything that wasn't followed by a deadline. That hit him. I could see it. For once, he had no immediate response. You're different lately, he said. No. I'm free lately. His gaze dropped to the folder in my hand. You still intend to leave? Absolutely. And where will you go? Somewhere I can sleep past 2 in the morning. He almost smiled, but it disappeared quickly. The next day, he tried the non-compete again. If you join a competitor, I'll enforce it. I gave him a pleasant smile. Then have your attorney send the paperwork to mine. His expression hardened. You're hiding something. Everyone hides something. What are you hiding? My patience. He stared at me. Brooke. Yes? Why are you acting like this? I looked at the countdown on my phone. 22 days left. Because I finally remembered I'm a person. He said nothing. I walked away. The next morning, something happened that I never expected. I arrived at the office and discovered Brian had already called twice. Then again. Then again. I ignored every call. I wasn't obligated to answer outside work hours, and I was done pretending otherwise. At 7:40, Janice sent me a message. You need to see this. She attached a photo. Brian was standing beside my empty desk holding his coffee, staring at the chair as if it had betrayed him. Apollo was lying underneath it. Where's Brooke? Brian had apparently asked. Janice had answered, maybe she resigned. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped my phone. The man who had spent 3 years treating my presence as invisible had suddenly noticed my absence. But he had no idea what was coming. Because the next morning was the annual summit, and I had no intention of attending as his assistant. I would walk into that ballroom as Brooke Callahan, daughter of the man who owned his biggest competitor. And for the first time, Adrian Lancaster was going to meet the woman he had spent 3 years ordering around. Part 3. The morning of the summit, I woke up without an alarm. No phone call. No emergency. No coffee temperature requirement. No Adrian Lancaster telling me that his car was arriving in 10 minutes. I lay in bed for a few seconds simply enjoying the silence. Then I smiled. I dressed in a dark blue tailored suit, put on diamond earrings my father had given me years ago, and walked out of my apartment feeling like myself for the first time in years. I wasn't wearing an assistant badge. I wasn't carrying a tote bag filled with chargers, emergency cuff links, mints, dog treats, documents, and whatever else Brian might suddenly decide he needed. I was Brooke Callahan. And I was going home. By 7:30, my phone was full of messages from Janice. Coffee disaster. Investor packets missing. Car schedule is messed up. Then another message arrived. Apollo is sitting at your desk. I laughed. A minute later, Brian called. I let it ring. He called again. I ignored it. At 8:30, I entered the summit ballroom beside my father. Richard Callahan walked through the doors first, calm and confident, with the unmistakable presence of a man accustomed to being obeyed. I walked beside him. Conversations stopped. Heads turned. Janice saw me and nearly dropped her folder. Apollo saw me and immediately escaped from whoever was holding his leash. He ran straight toward me. I crouched and scratched his ears. At least one Lancaster has good judgment. My father smiled. Brian stood several feet away, completely still. I watched realization spread across his face. He looked at my father. Then at me. Then back at my father. Adrian Lancaster, Dad said pleasantly, I'd like you to meet my daughter, Brooke Callahan. She'll be taking over several of our executive operations. Silence. Beautiful, perfect silence. Brian's expression barely changed, but I saw the shock in his eyes. He had spent 3 years ordering around the daughter of his industry's biggest competitor without ever realizing who she was. I smiled politely. Good morning, Mr. Lancaster. I hope everything is running smoothly. His jaw tightened. Brooke. Actually, Miss Callahan today. My father gave me a proud glance. She'll be leading our side of today's negotiations. Brian's eyes stayed on me. You never told me. You never asked. The answer landed harder than any insult could have. The summit began 15 minutes late. Normally, that would have sent Brian into a quiet rage. Today, he had no choice but to follow my schedule. I walked onto the stage and opened the presentation. Before we discuss the partnership, I said, I'd like to address operational structure. The first slide appeared. It showed after-hours call records. 2:47 a.m. The next slide showed personal errands, dog walking, dry cleaning, coffee temperature demands, and repeated requests outside normal working hours. Brian looked at me from across the room. Brooke, this isn't appropriate. I smiled. Actually, it is exactly the appropriate time. A few executives shifted uncomfortably. I continued. An organization cannot claim efficiency when its systems depend on one exhausted employee being available 24 hours a day. Another slide appeared. The resignation letter. Under Brian's coffee cup. A murmur traveled through the room. Someone from the Callaway delegation whispered, "Oh, that's brutal." Brian's face turned slightly red. I wasn't finished. This document was my formal resignation. It was rejected. When I submitted it again, it became a coaster. Brian stood. That's enough. I looked at him. No. It isn't. My father remained seated, watching silently. Then there was the non-compete threat, I continued. A threat that becomes particularly interesting when the employee is moving into an executive position at the company listed as your strategic competitor. Brian's expression hardened. You knew? Of course. And you worked here anyway? Yes. Why? I looked at him. Because I wanted to earn something without my father's name doing the work for me. That was the first time I saw something like regret cross his face. I clicked to the next slide. The Callaway-Lancaster partnership will not proceed under the original terms. The room became completely silent. New conditions will be required. First, an internal review of executive workplace practices. Second, overtime compensation for affected employees. Third, a formal after-hours policy. Fourth, the non-compete threat against me must be withdrawn in writing. Fifth, the assistant department must be expanded into an actual team rather than relying on one person to absorb the workload of an entire executive office. Brian stared at me. And what else? I held his gaze. I negotiate as an equal representative of Callaway Enterprises. Never again as your assistant. My father leaned back, satisfied. The room erupted into discussion. Some executives looked uncomfortable. Others looked relieved. Janice was practically glowing. The negotiations lasted 2 hours. By the end, Brian had agreed to every major condition. But the most surprising part happened afterward. I went to his office to collect the last few things from my desk. He was standing by the window. For once, there was no paperwork in his hands. Brooke. I stopped. Yes? He turned around. I was wrong. I waited. About you. About the way I treated you. I said nothing. I thought you were efficient. Reliable. Always available. You forgot human. He nodded. Yes. The word sounded difficult for him. I don't know how to fix it. I picked up the small silver pen from my desk. You don't get to ask me to teach you how to repair what you broke. He lowered his eyes. Fair. I walked toward the door. Your resignation is accepted, he said quietly. I stopped. The non-compete is withdrawn. Effective immediately. I turned around. Thank you. He nodded. It was the first time he had ever given me something without expecting a task in return. That evening, the official announcement went out to the staff. My resignation had been accepted. The non-compete was removed. The assistant department would be restructured. Overtime would be reviewed. Janice sent me a screenshot. I can't believe this is happening. I replied, neither can I. The next morning, the first replacement assistant lasted less than 3 hours. Apparently, Brian requested coffee at a specific temperature, a car arrangement, 2 revised documents, and emergency cuff links before 9. The assistant looked at him and said, "That's not in my job description." Brian apparently stared at her for several seconds before responding, "You're right." Janice nearly fainted when she told me. He's learning. Slowly. Very slowly. I spent the following weeks at Callaway Enterprises preparing to take on my new responsibilities. For the first time, people listened when I spoke. Not because I was Brian's assistant, but because I was Brooke Callaway. My father was proud, but he also insisted I take the 3-month break he had promised. So I traveled. Bali. The Maldives. Then Norway for the Northern Lights. I slept late. I read books. I walked barefoot on beaches. And not once did my phone ring at 2:47 in the morning. Brian never contacted me personally. The only message I received was through official business email. "Enjoy your vacation. Nothing is urgent." I stared at those words for a long time. It was such a simple sentence. Yet coming from Brian Lancaster, it felt almost revolutionary. When I returned, I discovered he had actually changed. Not completely. He was still cold, still precise, still terrifying in board meetings. But his staff no longer looked afraid when he entered a room. He hired more assistants. Overtime was paid. After-hours boundaries were enforced. He walked Apollo himself. And, apparently, his coffee was still terrible. 2 weeks after my return, we had a partnership meeting. When it ended, Brian approached me. "Can I ask you something?" "Depends." "Dinner." I raised an eyebrow. "That sounds personal." "It is." "Then submit a request." For the first time, I saw him almost smile. "What are the approval requirements?" I folded my arms. "Evidence of personal growth." He nodded seriously. "I have documentation." Part 4. He actually had documentation. When Brian handed me the file, I almost laughed. Inside were copies of the new employee policies, proof that overtime had been paid, records showing the assistant department had been expanded, HR training confirmations, and the written withdrawal of my non-compete. At the very bottom was a handwritten note: "Apollo has been walked personally for 90 consecutive days." I looked at him. "You're using dog walking as evidence of character development?" "He is difficult." "You created him." "Fair." I closed the file. Dinner request received. His shoulders relaxed slightly. "Does that mean yes?" "It means under review." "How long?" "You made me wait 3 years." He nodded. "That's fair." I returned to work that day without giving him an answer. He didn't pressure me. That alone surprised me. The old Brian would have demanded an immediate response. The new Brian simply waited. 2 months passed. During that time, we worked together as equals on the Callaway-Lancaster partnership. I noticed the little changes. He stopped interrupting junior executives. He asked assistants whether tasks could wait until morning. He started saying thank you. He even apologized when he was wrong. Not often, but enough to prove he was trying. One afternoon, Janice called me laughing. "You'll never guess what happened." "What?" "Brian made his own coffee." "And?" "He drank it." "Did he survive?" "Barely." I laughed. "I'm proud of him." "Don't say that too loudly. He might develop feelings." The final partnership gala took place in early spring. This time, I stood on stage as Callaway Enterprises representative. Brian stood across the room as an equal partner. There was no assistant badge around my neck. No stack of emergency documents in my arms. No expectation that I would organize his entire existence. I had my own team, my own authority, and my own life. Janice had also been promoted into a senior financial role. She sent me a message before the ceremony. I'm officially rich adjacent. I replied, try not to spend it all on stress candles. Too late. I bought 6. During the signing ceremony, I took the microphone. A successful company isn't built by one person at the top, I said. It's built by hundreds of people whose work often goes unnoticed. Leadership isn't about making everyone else available to you. It's about making sure everyone has the support to do their job well. The applause was immediate. Then Brian stepped forward. He looked toward his employees before looking at the cameras. Lancaster Group asked too much from people and rewarded silence instead of initiative. That was a leadership failure, and it was mine. The room became quiet. Brooke Callahan taught me something I should have understood years ago. Efficiency without respect is simply another form of exploitation. Janice leaned toward me. I give him 20% credit for emotional literacy. I smiled. Generous. The bonus helped. After the ceremony, I stepped onto the terrace. The city lights stretched across Manhattan. A few minutes later, the door opened. Brian walked outside carrying 2 cups of coffee. He held one toward me. I eyed it suspiciously. Did you make this? Yes. What temperature? I stopped measuring it. I took a sip. This tastes better. He looked genuinely pleased. Good. We stood in silence for a moment. Then he spoke. I don't want an assistant. I glanced at him. Good. I don't want someone to organize my life because I refuse to organize it myself. Excellent. And I don't want you to work for me. That's probably for the best. He nodded. Then he looked directly at me. I want you. I said nothing. Not as an employee. Not because I need something from you. I want to know you. If you'll allow it. For the first time, there was no command in his voice. No entitlement. No expectation. Just a question. I studied the man in front of me. He was still Brian Lancaster. Still intimidating. Still painfully controlled. But the arrogance had cracked. Respect had taken its place. And maybe that was the only foundation on which anything between us could possibly work. One dinner, I said. His eyes softened. 1. Probation. How long? I'm a Callaway. We prefer long-term contracts. A faint smile appeared on his face. I accept. Before I could respond, Apollo burst through the terrace door and ran straight toward me. I laughed and scratched his ears. Brian watched his dog completely ignore him. He still likes you more. Smart dog. I raised him. Exactly. He laughed quietly. It was such a rare sound that I almost forgot how cold he used to be. He extended his hand. I looked at it for a second before taking it. Not because I needed Brian Lancaster. I didn't. Not because he was rich. I had grown up surrounded by wealth. And certainly not because I wanted the life I had once imagined with him. I took his hand because he had finally learned that love without respect was worthless. 3 years earlier, Brian thought I was part of his office equipment. Something reliable that could be switched on whenever he needed something. He never noticed the woman behind the calendar, the coffee cup, the dog leash, and the endless lists. Then I resigned. I walked away. I returned to my family, became an executive in my own right, and discovered that leaving him was the best thing I could have done for myself. Brian lost his assistant that day. But he gained something far more important, the realization that people were not tools. As for me, I stopped answering calls at 2:47 in the morning. I stopped warming milk. I stopped carrying his life in a bag over my shoulder. I stopped asking permission to exist. And somewhere along the way, the coldest man in Manhattan learned how to knock before entering my life. Love didn't come first. Respect did. And that made all the difference. So, was I too forgiving? Should Brooke have walked away forever, or did Brian earn his second chance? Tell me in the comments. If you think she was right to make him work for every ounce of trust, say so. And if you want even colder revenge in the next story, make sure you subscribe, because the next woman might not give her billionaire a second chance at all.